Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the Norman dynasty in part 2, beginning with the remarkable reign of Henry I, England's most unlikely yet accomplished Norman monarch, and gently arriving at the tumultuous era of King Stephen and the Anarchy, a time when civil war would test the very foundations of the realm. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which moment in Norman history fascinates you most, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of medieval castles and forgotten battles to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Henry, later known as Henry the Firm of England, most likely entered this world in England around 1068, though the precise circumstances of his birth remain unclear. Today, his father was William of Normandy, the Duke of Normandy in northern France, a region which had developed from the Norse principality that had been founded there by the Viking leader Rollo in the early 10th century. Consequently, Henry was of partial Norse or Norman heritage and of French lineage. His father had been Duke of Normandy for many years, but starting in 1066, he had initiated the conquest of England and subsequent rise to the position of king. Thus, it appears that Henry was born in Britain shortly after the Norman conquest began. Henry's mother was Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of Baldwin III, Count of Flanders, a major principality to the east of Normandy in what is now Belgium. She had wed William in the early 1050s, and together they had 8 children, 4 sons and 4 daughters. Henry was the youngest of the 8, because he had 3 older brothers: Robert, born around 1051, Richard, born shortly after Robert, and William Rufus, born around 1056. It was extremely unlikely that Henry would inherit his father's position as a major ruler of the family's principalities, although the death of Richard in 1070 or 1071 during a hunting accident in the New Forest in southern England did increase the chances of Henry playing a significant role in the politics of England and Normandy at some future date. Henry's existence would be shaped by events which were already in motion when he was born. His father had been Duke of Normandy since 1035, when Henry's grandfather Robert had died prematurely. At that time, William was only a child, and it was not until after a lengthy power struggle with his own nobles and rivals for the dukedom that William had eventually secured his rule over Normandy around 1060. An effective feudal overlord, William was eager to expand his realms even further, and an opportunity soon presented itself from across the English Channel, where the King of England, Edward the Confessor, did not have an heir. When Edward eventually died in the first days of 1066, his brother-in-law Harold Godwinson succeeded him, but his claim to the throne was weak, and he soon faced rival claims. One of these came from Henry's father, who had visited England in 1051 and claimed that Edward had offered him his throne after he died. At that time, accordingly, William invaded southern England in the autumn of 1066 and swiftly defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings. A brutal policy of conquest was pursued in the years that followed, with William's Norman knights completely overthrowing the old Anglo-Saxon and Danish aristocracy across England. This Norman conquest was still underway when Henry was born. What is notable is that once it was complete, William would rule his French possessions separately from his English holdings. Indeed, he spent much of his later years, even after conquering England, in France. It was also relatively clear from an early date that he intended to divide his territories when it came to passing them to his sons. It was not assumed that Robert, as his father's eldest surviving son, would succeed as both King of England and Duke of Normandy. Our sources for Henry's life and times are relatively plentiful by comparison with those for many other monarchs of medieval Europe. The former account is provided by Orderic Vitalis, an English Benedictine monk and historical chronicler, who was a contemporary of Henry's, having been born in 1075. His Historia Ecclesiastica, or Ecclesiastical History, provides an account of English history, which is heavily focused on the Norman conquest and the subsequent period through the rule of William and his sons. A near contemporary of Vitalis, William of Malmesbury, composed numerous works and is generally deemed to be the most significant historian writing in Europe in the 12th century. His accounts of church history and the conflicts within England provide great insight into Henry's reign. Both Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury are usually deemed to have been relatively objective and accurate historians, and as such, we have relatively reliable sources with which to evaluate Henry's life and reign. Others, such as the theologian and church figure Aelred, were more biased owing to a dispute within the English church during the 12th century, concerning an argument over whether the Archbishop of Canterbury or of York had primacy within the English church. These are supplemented by a wide range of administrative records such as royal charters, church records, and pipe rolls, all of a kind that is simply unavailable for the periods prior to the Norman conquest of England. As the uncertainty surrounding his place and time of birth would suggest, there is a frustrating lack of evidence about Henry's early life. There is, for instance, a debate amongst historians of the period over whether Henry was primarily raised and educated in England or in Normandy. The latter seems more likely, given that his father continued to view himself primarily as a French lord, and the family ancestral seat was in northern France. Wherever he was raised, it is quite likely that he had little relationship with his two surviving older brothers, Robert and William Rufus, during his childhood, as their significant age gap of between 12 and 17 years ensured that Robert and William were beginning to aid their father in ruling England and Normandy, while Henry was still a child. This estrangement from his brothers is significant for later events, as it holds out the possibility that their fraternal bonds were not strong. Henry was most likely educated by Osmond, Bishop of Salisbury, and was possibly being trained for a life as a prominent church figure, a typical role for a younger son of a king such as himself. As a result, he was probably better educated than his father, with an ability to read and write Latin and some scholarly training of a kind which William the Conqueror cannot be said to have had. This aside, it is now believed by historians that the cognomen, which late medieval chroniclers later gave Henry Beauclerc, meaning that he was well educated, was probably excessive. While Henry was more learned than his father and other ancestors, he was no scholar king. His father knighted him in May 1086, when Henry was probably around 18 years of age. William the Conqueror's knighting of his youngest son was one of his last significant acts that we know of. He died not much more than a year later on the 9th of September 1087, after sustaining injuries while campaigning militarily in Vexin, France. Henry attended on his father at Rouen in Normandy before he died. There, the dying king decided on the succession. Although primogeniture, the concept that the firstborn son of a monarch or lord should succeed him, emerged eventually to be paramount in Norman culture and across much of Europe. This principle was not firmly in place by the late 11th century. Moreover, the fact that William's two main territories, the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Normandy, were two different polities, ensured that it was very plausible that one of his sons would become King of England and another Duke of Normandy. This is exactly what the Conqueror decided on. He bestowed the Duchy of Normandy on Robert as the eldest son and the Kingdom of England on William Rufus. While this arrangement had the benefit of William being able to claim he was bestowing his patrimony, the Duchy of Normandy, which he had inherited from his own father on Robert as the eldest son, William was effectively favouring William Rufus in making him King of England. As he preferred his second eldest son, Henry, the youngest was left out of this arrangement. As expected, he was compensated with extensive estates in Buckinghamshire and Gloucestershire in England and a large sum of money. Robert was unwilling to accept his father's dispensation, and war followed between him and William Rufus immediately following the Conqueror's death. Henry was soon drawn into this. He decided to remain in Normandy, and his presence there effectively ensured that he would ally with Robert against William Rufus. Robert needed access to the money which their father had bestowed on Henry to help him raise additional military forces. On top of this, William Rufus drove Henry into their elder brother's camp when he quickly confiscated Henry's estates that he had been granted in Buckinghamshire and Gloucestershire in England. Faced with this situation, Henry began negotiating with Robert. An agreement was soon reached whereby Henry would ally with Robert and provide him with financing and the support of Henry's allies and followers. But perhaps most importantly, Robert agreed to bestow some of his lands in northern France on Henry, specifically the Cantal Peninsula region, also known today as the Cherbourg Peninsula in Normandy, on the northwest coast of modern-day France. Here, Henry would have the title of Count of the Cantal, And while he would be nominally answerable to Robert as Duke of Normandy, Henry would effectively have his own patrimony. Thus, the war which immediately broke out between Robert and William Rufus following their father's death benefited Henry substantially. Unfortunately, Henry's time as Count of the Cantal would be short-lived. Although the first year or so of his rule there allowed him to begin building up a strong power base of supporters in western Normandy, west into Brittany, he was challenged by many figures, not least the powerful Bishop of Bayeux, Odo, who managed to undermine Henry by convincing Robert that his younger brother was secretly conspiring with William Rufus. A brief trip by Henry to England to try to convince William that he should allow him to hold the estates which had once belonged to their mother in England. She, having died several years earlier, did nothing to assuage Robert's fears that Henry was in fact conspiring with William. So when he returned to northern France in the autumn of 1088, he was detained by Odo's forces. Robert took back possession of the Cantal, which he had only recently granted to Henry, though he soon set Henry at liberty. Thus, Henry found himself floundering to some extent as the 1090s dawned. As his two older brothers continued to wage war against each other across the English Channel, the rivalry between Robert and William Rufus continued into the early 1090s. In 1091, William Rufus invaded Normandy, though this soon turned completely against Henry, as William and Robert came to an agreement whereby Robert would accept William's position as King of England in return for aid in helping Robert to re-establish control over Normandy and his other lands in northern France against fractious lords such as Henry. Thus, Henry found himself challenged by both his brothers in 1091, a scenario which led him to retreat southwards into the Vexin region of France. There, he waited for a new falling out between William and Robert, which duly followed in 1092. Henry, now determined to ally with William against Robert, fixed his mast to the King of England's from 1092 onwards. In this way, he was able to expand his own power base in northern France and gradually began to seize control of parts of Normandy with his brother's aid from Robert. Henry's growing power was facilitated in 1095 when Robert elected to take the cross and to journey to the Holy Land as part of the First Crusade. With this, Henry began establishing himself as the preeminent power in Normandy, with William ruling England. The alliance between the two brothers held for the remainder of the 1090s, and together they re-established the family's control over much of northern France. Henry might have remained a prominent lord in northern France, or perhaps a falling out would have resulted eventually between himself and William Rufus. But in the end, even on the 2nd of April 1100, while hunting in the New Forest near Brockenhurst, William Rufus overtook both of them. This was the same vast forest where their older brother Richard had died 3 decades earlier in a hunting accident. William Rufus was shot through the chest with an arrow that seems to have been unleashed accidentally by a minor noble named Walter Terrell. There was not much by way of decorum in the moments that followed. The king's body was seemingly left lying on the ground as the members of William's party fled the scene in haste to plot the succession. William had not married or had children, and it seems plausible that he was gay. It also seems plausible that Henry had decided to capitalize on William's lack of a successor and Robert's continued absence while on crusade by having William murdered. In the New Forest, and making it seem like an accident, we will never know the truth of this. But what we do know is that Henry and his followers moved quickly to secure the royal residences and the English treasury at Winchester. He was quickly claimed as King Henry the Fifth of England in succession to his brother. Only then was William Rufus's body recovered from the New Forest and sent to Winchester Cathedral for burial. Henry was now King of England, but Robert would not accept this lightly. As William the Conqueror's eldest son, he had already been passed over for the throne of England once, and he did not intend to let Henry's seeming usurpation of the crown go unchallenged. At the time of William's death, Robert was on his way back across Europe from the Holy Land, the First Crusade having ended in absolute triumph in the summer of 1099 with the capture of Jerusalem from the Muslim occupants. With this, Robert headed home. When he reached France, he publicly professed his claim to the throne of England, in spite of the fact that Henry had been crowned at Westminster on the 5th of August 1100, just 3 days after William Rufus's death. However, not all accepted Henry's coronation, and with Robert's return, a new war would ensue between the two remaining sons of William the Conqueror, to see who would now claim the throne of the kingdom that the Normans had conquered just over 3 decades earlier. Henry's opening gambit in this new conflict was to negotiate a marriage alliance with the King of Scotland, Malcolm III, by marrying Malcolm's daughter Matilda. This was a judicious move for multiple reasons. Firstly, it ensured that if Henry was going to have to wage a war against his brother across the English Channel, his northern flank would not be attacked by the Scots. Instead, he would be able to call on aid from England's northern neighbour. Secondly, Matilda's mother was Margaret of Wessex, a descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal house of Wessex. Consequently, in marrying Matilda, Henry was marrying into the noble line of England and cementing his claim to the throne, particularly the claim which any child born of his and Matilda's marriage would have. It was also well past time for Henry, as a man in his early 30s, to marry and produce a legitimate heir. Thus, it was that on the 11th of November 1100, just 3 months after his proclamation and coronation as king, Henry married Matilda in Westminster Abbey. As we will see, their marriage became problematic as the years went by, owing to a dearth of children. Within months of his marriage to Matilda, there was also the possibility of peace with Robert. The clash between Henry and his brother appeared to come to something of a conclusion in 1101, when the two feuding brothers agreed to peace terms through the Treaty of Alton, named after the town of Alton in Hampshire in the south of England, where the pair met that year to work out an agreement to end the conflict between them. Through the treaty, Robert agreed to acknowledge Henry as the King of England in succession, to William Rufus in return for a wide range of concessions. Firstly, Robert would be paid a significant yearly stipend of 3,000 marks out of the English treasury to compensate him for relinquishing any claims to England's crown revenues and estate. Henry also relinquished nearly all of his claim to the family's lands in France, though he would retain a small estate there for when he visited Normandy. As neither of the two brothers as yet had a legitimate male heir to succeed them, both agreed at Alton that if they died, the other would succeed them to their lands. This latter point opened the door for future conflicts, as it would place whichever brother produced a male heir first in an advantageous position. Nevertheless, the Treaty of Alton briefly held out the prospect of peace between the two brothers, with Henry ruling England and Robert controlling Normandy. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Alton, Henry began demoting a number of senior nobles and church figures who had been stewards of the English church and aristocracy since his father's time. Men like Robert Dare and William Doran, Earl of S, whose loyalty Henry viewed as suspect, were replaced. He promoted others in their stead, and this policy of promoting new men, individuals who had not held senior ecclesiastical positions, noble, titles, or government office during the reigns of his father or elder brother, became a common feature of his reign. Admer testified to this in his Historia Ecclesiastica, stating that Henry pulled down many great men from positions of eminence and sentenced them to be disinherited. On the other hand, he ennobled others of base stock who had served him well, raised them, so to say, from the dust, and heaped all kinds of favours on them, stationing them above earls and famous constables. Witnesses of the truth of my words are Geoffrey de Clinton, Ralph Bassett, Hugh of Buckland, Wigrip, Rayner of B, William Trutt, Howe of F, Wigan, Allison, Robert of Boster, and many others who have heaped up riches and built lavishly on a scale far beyond the means of their fathers. Witnesses too are the men who, on trumped up and unjust pretexts, have been oppressed by them. The king raised to high rank all of these and many others of low birth, whom it would be tedious to name individually. He lifted them out of insignificance by his royal authority, set them on the summit of power, and made them formidable even to the greatest magnates of the kingdom. Eadmer's assertions are supported by other contemporary or near-contemporary accounts of Henry's reign, and there is little doubt that he did engage in such behaviour. Geoffrey de Clinton was perhaps the most prominent of these. Although he started the reign as a minor landholder and official in the late 1110s, he gained the trust of the king. When Herbert Camerarius, the royal treasurer, fell from favour in 1118, Henry promoted Geoffrey to be the equivalent of his minister for finance. Clinton also benefited enormously in terms of land and wealth, acquiring large estates through royal grants, particularly in Warwickshire, where he began construction of Kenilworth Castle. Another of those whom Eadmer mentioned, Ralph Bassett, was a legal officer who was born in Normandy. Henry plucked him from relative obscurity shortly after his accession and made him one of England and Normandy's most senior judges, a position which he held for a quarter of a century. Many others were promoted in this way, often at the expense of families who had prospered under Henry's father and brother. Yet, it was not highly incongruous or inappropriate for Henry to act in this way. Medieval monarchs often promoted their allies to senior government positions and to act as their representatives as landholders in the provinces. For a king like Henry, who had struggled to assert himself within his family and faced continuing threats from his brother, it was simply wise to promote his allies in this way. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that the phenomenon of the new men, as 19th century historians term them, created resentments towards Henry in many circles and coloured opinions concerning his reign. The terms of the peace between Henry and Robert, which were negotiated and agreed upon at Tunbridge, did not last long. In the course of 1102 and early 1103, Henry managed to strengthen his alliance network in northern France and began preparing for a fresh move against Robert. For his part, Robert was unable to control many of his nobles in Normandy. This was one of the major underlying causes of the conflicts which ensued for 20 years after William the Conqueror's death. As his eldest son, Robert viewed himself as the rightful ruler of some of the family's dominions, but he was a weak, ineffectual ruler who could never gain the loyalty of the Norman nobles. Indeed, an anecdote related by Edmer in his History of the Time relates how Robert was supposed to hear an Easter sermon given by the Bishop of Sées, Serlo, in 1105 live, but could not attend because he got drunk the night beforehand and awoke to find that some of his followers had stolen his clothes. This is hardly indicative of a ruler who inspired the respect of his subjects. It was this poor leadership which fomented much of the conflict between him and Henry and William Rufus earlier. Accordingly, Henry invaded Normandy in 1104 and again in 1105, demonstrating to his older brother that he would continue to undermine his position so long as Robert showed that he was vulnerable. Ultimately, these clashes came to a climax in 1106 when Henry launched a fresh foray across the English Channel. On this occasion, his campaign focused on efforts to seize the castle of Tinchebray in Normandy. Robert eventually elected to meet him here on the field in open battle. The Battle of Tinchebray, which was fought on the 28th of September 1106, would finally bring the conflicts between the sons of William the Conqueror, which had started following his death nearly 2 decades earlier, to an end. Estimates of the size of medieval armies are notoriously difficult to determine with accuracy, owing to the medieval chroniclers' tendency to exaggerate or minimize the size of armies depending on which side they wanted to extol the martial virtues of. But it is generally agreed that Henry and Robert had forces of relatively equal size at Tinchebray, perhaps between 6,000 and 7,000 men each, though Henry probably had a numerical advantage in terms of cavalry, which gave him an edge when the two brothers met that autumn day. Yet the English king allegedly ordered his knights to dismount, and the battle became primarily an infantry engagement. Henry's forces attacked in 2 wings, led by William, Count of Evreux, with a 3rd detachment in reserve. In the end, it was the utilization of the reserve force which broke Robert's lines and ended in a rout, with Henry's forces emerging victorious after an hour of clashes. By the time the Battle of Tinchebray ended, hundreds of Robert's men lay, dead or severely wounded. But the truly conclusive element to the battle was the capture of many of Robert's senior nobles and the Duke himself. With his brother's detention, Henry was finally in a position to end the conflict between the pair and to fully unite the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Normandy under the sole rule of a son of William the Conqueror. Henry's response to this position of power was ruthless and is in part the explanation for his later reputation for cruelty. He had Robert taken to England and imprisoned in Devizes Castle in Wiltshire, a fortress erected during their father's time in the English countryside. Then, Henry had himself proclaimed as Duke of Normandy, uniting England and the Norman territories in northern France under his sole rule. Robert would be kept under house arrest in Devizes Castle for the next 20 years, only being moved in the mid-1120s to Cardiff Castle as a precautionary measure during a period when Henry faced a revolt in France from Robert's adult son. He would then live out the remaining years. The years of his life in the Welsh fortress ended when he died in February 1134, an old man well into his 80s. At that time, it was perhaps a cruel dispensation which Henry elected to adopt for his brother. But perhaps Robert had brought it on himself in his unwillingness to accept anyone else as his father's rightful successor. In any event, it had the desired result. From 1106 onwards, following Tashbiar and Robert's imprisonment, peace of a sort finally prevailed in England and Normandy, which were united under Henry's sole rule. After decades of conflict, with the end of the fraternal war between Henry and Robert, Henry was at last free to begin ruling his territories as a peacetime monarch. Like all monarchs during the High Middle Ages, Henry had to govern through his nobles and senior church figures, a necessity at a time when government bureaucracy was limited and the tentacles of the state were short. As such, ruling at this time was as much about managing the feudal lords, who in turn administered individual parts of the realm, as exercising strong kingship from the center. As we have seen, Henry did so in large part by promoting his allies to positions of unprecedented power and replacing older nobles and officials who had first risen under either his father or brother. Often, he could be brutal in this, severely punishing recalcitrant barons and earls who refused to bend to his will. This has added to his reputation for cruelty and to the controversy surrounding the new men in his own time and ever since. Yet, it was effective. By the 1110s, Henry had succeeded in establishing a stable, well-governed kingdom that was more at peace than at any time since the last years of his father's reign. At the heart of this was the royal household, or domus. This was the forerunner of the later medieval and early modern royal courts. The household consisted not just of the king and his family, but senior officials and church figures, as well as a substantial retinue of troops to guard the king and the royal family. By the time Henry claimed the throne of England, a series of royal palaces were already emerging as the locations in which the royal court was located. These included Westminster and Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, though many of the most famous English royal palaces and castles, such as those at Windsor and Buckingham, were the products of later centuries. In addition to his residence at Woodstock or in Rouen when in France, Henry would often travel around England and Normandy with a cohort of civil and ecclesiastical lawyers in train, dispensing justice. This was the forerunner of the sessions, of a size which in turn would be replaced in time by circuit courts. What all of this achieved was a system whereby the new hybrid Anglo-Norman laws could be enforced in the regions, giving Henry's subjects access to the tenets of royal justice. Two issues, above all others, were the most important in his governance of his realms. The first was taxation. The groundwork for effective taxation of England by the new Norman overlords had been laid down towards the end of William the Conqueror's reign, when the Domesday Book, a record of landholders and other individuals across England, was produced. However, the crown taxation system was clearly further developed by Henry and his officials. Revenues were paid into the exchequer, which was kept in Winchester. The first systematic records for these payments date to Henry's reign. These are called the pipe rolls, or great rolls of the pipe, so named because the parchment on which they were produced was rolled up when not in use and resembled a pipe when rolled in this way. These audited the accounts of taxes collected, submitted by the sheriffs of each locality, and essentially contained a record of the royal revenue from taxation. The first such pipe roll to have survived from the 12th century dates to 1130, towards the end of Henry's reign. But it is clear from this particular set of accounts that it was not the first one ever produced. Pipe rolls were produced earlier, in Henry's reign, which have unfortunately not survived down to the present day. What is significant about this is that these were the first concerted efforts at recording the amount of taxes which were being collected on a yearly basis and, as such, are some of the first records in medieval Europe which precede the development of a national exchequer. Henry's role in implementing such a system was significant. The other major issue which taxed Henry was the Church. By the 12th century, the Roman Catholic Church was the most powerful political institution in Europe, with archbishops and bishops wielding as much power as dukes and earls, often serving as senior ministers in the governments of kings and queens. However, in the middle of the 11th century, this power of the Church had led to clashes across Europe between rulers like the Holy Roman Emperors in Germany or indeed Henry's father and brother in England over who had the right to appoint archbishops, bishops, and the abbots of leading monastic houses? Should the Pope in Rome and the archbishops within a country have the overall responsibility for this? Or should a monarch have control over the appointment of senior church figures? This investiture controversy, as this clash between kings and popes is known, was still underway when Henry became King of England. Henry took an aggressive approach to resolving it, exiling the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, in 1105. He also appears to have commissioned a series of anonymous treatises known as the York Tracts, or Tractatus Eoric Canis, to discuss the legalities of the matter in a way which reflected well on the rights of the crown over the church. Eventually, these efforts resulted in a compromise, the Concordat of London of 1107, whereby Henry agreed to allow the Pope in Rome to invest the bishops and abbots of dioceses and religious houses across England, but those who were so appointed would also have to swear an oath of homage to the crown for the lands which they would come into possession of. In this way, Rome would maintain considerable control over the right of appointment or investiture, but these figures would also owe substantial loyalty to the crown as ecclesiastical lords. The Concord out of London eventually became the basis for agreements between the Pope and other European rulers to resolve the investiture crisis, but tensions would continue over the respective powers of the crown and the church for the remainder of the 12th century. Henry inherited an unstable situation on his western border. The Normans had made some efforts to conquer Wales as part of the Norman conquest of 1066 and the years that followed. Indeed, the conqueror, Henry's father, had granted some of his foremost followers lands in the West Midlands and the March region with the explicit goal of having them reduce the power of the Welsh lords and extend Norman control into Wales. This goal had been furthered to a large extent in the 1070s, but the outbreak of hostility amongst William's sons in the aftermath of his death had set the policy of conquering Wales back. Thus, it was not until Henry's reign that a proactive policy could be implemented again. In 1108, Henry campaigned into South Wales in an effort to force the lords there to submit to Norman rule. He met with considerable success, establishing Norman control over the region around Pembroke. However, despite years of further campaigning, the Welsh lords, particularly in the more mountainous regions of the north and Denbighshire, and other locals, remained obstinately independent. This led Henry to reach an accommodation with them in the mid-1110s, whereby they expressed nominal loyalty to him, but maintained a great degree of effective independence. Yet Robert's detention at Cardiff in the 1120s and early 1130s clearly pointed to a certain degree of influence throughout Wales for Henry in the latter stages of his reign. Meanwhile, Henry strengthened the March region along the English-Welsh border. Wales would remain an area of contested Norman rule for centuries to come, only being fully brought under English rule from the late 13th century onwards, a century and a half after Henry's own time. Further to the north, Henry's father had also sought to extend Norman control into Scotland. Though this had proved too ambitious at the time, Henry would not seek to emulate him, as his marriage to Matilda in 1100 had effectively led him to ally with the Scottish royal family. This arrangement held for many years, even through a succession of new kings in Scotland, which included Matilda's brother Alexander I from 1107 to 1124. Henry further strengthened his alliance with Alexander around the time of his succession, in Edinburgh by marrying one of his illegitimate daughters, Sibylla of Normandy, to Alexander. Hence, a firm alliance between England and Scotland prevailed for much of Henry's reign. Furthermore, when Alexander died in 1124, Henry aided his brother, and thus Henry's brother-in-law, David, to press his claim against a rival for power in the shape of Mac Alexander, an illegitimate son of Alexander's, who had obtained extensive support in the Scottish Isles and Highlands. Henry sent aid to David throughout a near 10-year war. In return, in later years, even after Henry's death, David supported the claim of Henry's daughter Matilda to succeed him as Queen of England. Overall, the relations between England and Scotland during Henry's reign were a model of harmony not regularly seen between the two nations during the High Middle Ages or late medieval period. Henry has the distinction of most likely establishing what was England's first zoo. This was established at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, a royal retreat which had acted as the location where King Alfred the Great had allegedly translated the Consolations of Philosophy by the late Roman philosopher Boethius 2 centuries earlier. There was little development here to speak of prior to Henry's time, but it was royal hunting land. It was here that Henry ordered the enclosure of the royal park with a wall around 1110. Then, inspired perhaps by his knowledge of zoos which had been created in Spain and other parts of Europe, he began filling the enclosure at Woodstock with exotic animals brought from afar. These included lions, porcupines, camels, and even some tigers. That animals of these kinds could be acquired and brought to England was perhaps not as unusual as it might first appear. After all, this was the age of the Crusades, and there were many ships crossing the Mediterranean every year between the trading republics in Italy and the new Crusader states in the Levant. As such, the trade in exotic animals brought from Asia and Africa was relatively common. However, it appears to have been Henry who first decided to place these in England into what we would call a zoo in modern terms. Throughout these years of reforming the government of England and addressing the clashes with the church, Henry was still troubled periodically by unrest in Normandy and in his other possessions in northern France. This was brought about in large part by the accession of Louis VI as King of France in 1108 and his determination to expand French royal control over his feudal lords, of which the Duke of Normandy was nominally one. Although it had been a long time since any French monarch had been strong enough to attempt to demand the homage of a ruler of Normandy, this challenge from the French crown was compounded by the threat posed by several other neighbouring lords, such as the Count of Anjou. In order to counter these forces, Henry courted the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, offering to marry his daughter Matilda to the emperor's son, also named Henry, the latter of whom eventually succeeded his father as Holy Roman Emperor with the title of Henry V in 1111. With this, the English king had acquired an alliance with arguably the most powerful ruler in Europe, in Christendom, a boon to his efforts to maintain control over Normandy and his French territories in the 1110s and 1120s, while his alliance with the imperial family in Germany strengthened Henry's position in France. Normandy was never peaceful, for long. Minor revolts arose frequently during the 1110s, but the most dangerous came about in 1115, when King Louis of France began promoting the claim of William Clito, a son of Henry's brother Robert and thus Henry's nephew, to succeed as Duke of Normandy. This claim, which was a useful tool for the French king to extend his control over the north of France, was backed by numerous other prominent lords of the region, notably the Count of Flanders in Belgium and elements within the county of Anjou to the southwest of Normandy. War ensued between Henry and the French Flemish, and it would continue for several years through the latter half of the 1110s, with Henry mounting campaigns to France in 1117 and 1118. These ended in stalemate, but the situation changed considerably. In 1119, when Henry convinced Count Fulk of Anjou to change sides, and then won a considerable victory over the French at the Battle of Bréhal on the 20th of August that year. With this, the war began to wind down, and early the following year, Henry reached an agreement with King Louis of France whereby the conflict ceased, and Louis agreed to acknowledge Henry as Duke of Normandy and his son as his successor in that position in return for Henry paying homage to Louis as King of France. The complex politics of the 1110s were rendered even more so by Henry's complex family life. He and his wife Matilda did have children, but they were few in number. A girl named Matilda, after her mother, was born in 1102, just over a year after their marriage. A boy named William Adelin followed in the early autumn of 1103. It has been speculated that a third child, a boy named Richard, was still born in the summer of 1101, but this does not seem credible given that Matilda was born in February 1102. In any event, what this meant is that Henry had only one legitimate son after many years on the throne. There was, though, no shortage of illegitimate children sired by him. In total, it is speculated that he had at least 20 illegitimate children from the early 1090s onwards. Of these, there was a roughly even mix of girls and boys, though slightly more daughters. The mothers of many of these illegitimate children are unknown in many instances, though some are known. For instance, Henry certainly sired children through a relationship with Lady Sibylla Corber of Alcester in the 1090s, though in some instances, all we have is a first name to go on, such as his mistress Edith. Yet, as numerous as these illegitimate children were, under the strictures of canon and common law at the time, they could not succeed Henry. Only a child born in wedlock could. Therefore, Henry's hopes of a smooth succession rested on his legitimate children, and in particular, on William, his only legitimate son. Henry's complex marital life and family tree might not have become an issue had William Adelin survived, but in the winter of 1120, one of the most infamous events in 12th century English and Norman history upended the line of succession. This was the White Ship incident. Throughout the century and a half following the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror, his successors, and the royal family and nobles maintained a steady stream of traffic across the English Channel. The kings of England, after all, were also the dukes of Normandy in many cases, and they needed to be regularly present in both of their dominions. As such, Henry and other members of his family and the nobility made dozens of trips across the English Channel during their lifetimes. One such occasion was in late November 1120, when Henry, his son and heir William, several of his illegitimate children, and a large contingent of the Norman nobility had been in Normandy. The court was returning to England on the 25th of November, 1120, when it was determined that the king's ship and other boats were insufficient to ferry everyone back to southern England. Accordingly, a newly fitted vessel, captained by Thomas Fitzstephen, a mariner whose father had captained the ship which delivered William the Conqueror across the Channel in 1066, was requisitioned for the task. Known as the White Ship, it would go down in history for sowing chaos in 12th century England. Henry left Normandy aboard his own vessel on the fateful day in November 1120. However, according to Orderic Vitalis, who provides the most detailed account of events, his son and heir William Adelin and two of his illegitimate children, Matilda Fitzroy and Richard of Lincoln, along with several senior English and Norman lords, boarded the White Ship. Several members of the party were drunk, and William insisted on bringing wine on board the ship. Then, as they prepared to depart, the party determined that they could make it back to England before the other ships and commanded the captain to make all haste across the Channel. It was a fateful decision. As the ship left port in the darkness, struck a submerged rock in the harbour near Barfleur, and began to sink. William apparently managed to make it to a small boat, but he tried to rescue his half-sister in the ensuing chaos and drowned along with her and his half-brother Richard, as did virtually everyone else. According to Vitalis, of the 300 people on board the ship, only one, a butcher from Rouen, survived. The White Ship was a disaster for Henry, upending the line of succession and ensuring that in decades to come, England and Normandy would be cast yet again into civil war. With the death of William Adelin, Henry's reign suddenly entered a period of crisis from which it would never fully emerge. Henry did have a surviving legitimate child, but this was his daughter Matilda. Although England did not follow the Salic law, an ancient Frankish law which was followed in France and prohibited women from succeeding, it was nevertheless extremely difficult to imagine the political community of England accepting Matilda as queen during a period when kingship was as much about being a leader on the field of battle as an effective administrator. Moreover, it became apparent in the early 1120s that many would not accept Matilda, a fact borne out by the outbreak of several rebellions across England and the Welsh border in the early 1120s, as Henry's subjects stressed their independence. Yet Henry was undaunted. He was determined that if he did die without any other legitimate children, Matilda would succeed him, stressing that she had married Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, in 1114, and that their marriage placed England and Normandy in a favourable alliance. Yet even this was scuppered in 1125 when the emperor died prematurely. Henry quickly responded by negotiating a new marriage between Matilda and Geoffrey, heir to the county of Anjou to the south of Normandy, in France. Through this arrangement, Henry sought to argue that Geoffrey would be associated with Matilda as king consort if she became queen. In this way, he hoped to sell the idea of Matilda succeeding him to the English nobility. This was not Henry's only strategy. He was also seeking to produce another legitimate male heir in the 1120s. After the White Ship disaster, Henry's first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died on the 1st of May 1118, still shy of her 40th birthday. Henry had not remarried immediately, but in the aftermath of the White Ship, he determined to do so. There had already been tentative negotiations to this effect between Henry and Count Godfrey of Louvain, for the English king to marry Godfrey's daughter, Adeliza. These were expedited in the aftermath of the White Ship, and on the 24th of January, 1121, Henry, at approximately 54 years of age, married 18-year-old Adeliza. However, despite the fact that there is evidence to suggest that Adeliza travelled extensively with Henry between England and Normandy in the 1120s and early 1130s, perhaps to improve the possibility of conception, no child resulted from the union. This is somewhat peculiar, as Henry was certainly not sterile, as his number of illegitimate children amply demonstrates. While Adeliza would go on in later years to have children during her second marriage after Henry's death, what this meant during Henry's lifetime is that all of his hopes of a direct succession rested on his daughter Matilda. This situation brought fresh challenges in the last decade or so of Henry's reign. One of the possible avenues of concern when it came to the now contentious succession was the possibility that either Henry's brother Robert might become a focus of conspiracy yet again, or more likely, his son William Clito, who was born in 1102 and was an adult by medieval standards by the time of the White Ship. Indeed, Henry's nephew had already been a fulcrum for opposition to Henry in the 1110s. Robert remained under arrest and would remain so until his death at roughly 80 years of age in 1134. But William was another matter. Following the White Ship, he became a renewed focus of conspiracy among certain Norman lords who were unhappy with Henry's reign and his promotion of the new men. Consequently, in 1123, they began plotting a new rebellion, one which gained strength, from proposed plans by Count Fulco of Anjou to marry his daughter, Scylla, to William Clito and give him a toehold in the county of Maine as her dowry. Henry managed to successfully appeal against the marriage as a breach of canon law, but William nevertheless remained a problem during the mid-1120s, particularly so from March 1127, when he succeeded to the significant title of Count of Flanders in what is now Belgium. Using this position and a powerful alliance of French and Flemish lords, he made war on Henry in Normandy in 1127 and 1128, but it ultimately proved to be his undoing. While laying siege to the town of Alençon in the summer of 1128, he suffered a wound to his arm, which turned gangrenous and led to his death on the 28th of July. Without any son and heir, the threat which William and his line posed to Henry died out, though his death did nothing to solve the wider succession problem. Henry's last years were spent primarily trying to prepare England and Normandy for the succession. In 1128, Matilda married Geoffrey of Anjou as a precursor to succeeding her father. Their position was strengthened when Geoffrey's father, the Count of Anjou, left France altogether to head to the Crusader states in the Holy Land, leaving Geoffrey as the new count. Yet their marriage was problematic, as Matilda did not get along with her new husband, and they often spent considerable periods of time apart, tensions which were known to the wider political community and which threatened the succession resolution which Henry was aiming to implement. Things improved in the early 1130s, after a reconciliation between Matilda and Geoffrey in 1131, and much to Henry's satisfaction, Matilda gave birth to two sons, Henry and Geoffrey, in 1133 and 1134, the older of whom, known as Henry Fitz-Empress, on account of Matilda having formerly been the wife of the Holy Roman Emperor, would potentially succeed Matilda one day. The presence of a grandson strengthened the possibility that the political community in England and Normandy would accept Henry's succession arrangements and Matilda as queen after he died. As such, Henry had some reasons to be confident of a peaceful succession in his last years. This was the scenario which largely pertained at Henry's death. His demise has a colourful aspect to it. According to Henry of Huntingdon, a contemporary of Henry's who was alive at the time of the king's death, the king died from eating too many lampreys, a kind of freshwater eelfish, as related by the chronicler. In his Historia Anglorum, or History of the English, the king's health is said to have deteriorated in the days which followed his gluttonous indulgence, feast of fish, and he eventually died on the 1st of December 1135 at Est-Denis-Oron in Normandy, aged around 66 or 67, while one would be forgiven for dismissing as fanciful Huntington's claim that it was an excessive meal of fish which killed the king. It has been speculated by historians in recent years that there may have been some truth to this, and that Henry met his end owing to ptomaine poisoning, an excess of amino compounds, which can result from eating food contaminated by bacteria. Whatever, The truth of it, whether fish or sheer old age claimed the king, we do know that his funeral was held in northern France, with his body taken to Rouen, the ancestral home of the Dukes of Normandy. There, his entrails were removed and buried at the priory of Nram-du-Pré before his body was taken across the Channel to England and buried at Reading Abbey. Despite his efforts to ensure a peaceful succession after he was gone, England and Normandy soon descended into a period of conflict known as the Anarchy. The English nobility was unwilling to accept a female ruler, and despite Matilda having been designated by Henry as his successor, many of the leading nobles of the realm quickly sided with Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, the son of Adela, Henry's sister, when he put forward a claim to succeed Henry just days after the old king's death. Yet, not everyone was willing to show such disloyalty to Henry's wishes, and Matilda and her husband Geoffrey began building their own base of support in France, with which she invaded England in 1139 in an effort to overthrow Stephen and claim her rightful position as queen. Despite capturing Stephen in the early 1140s, he was soon released as part of a prisoner exchange, and the wars both in England and northern France continued throughout the decade. Eventually, they began to focus on whether Stephen's son Eustace would succeed him as king or Matilda's son, Henry Fitz-Empress. Eustace's death in 1153 paved the way for Stephen to accept Henry Fitz-Empress as his designated successor, and so when Stephen died in 1154, Henry III's grandson finally succeeded as King Henry II, restoring much-needed order to England and Normandy. In the process, Henry VI was one of England's most unlikely kings. He was born around 1068, the youngest of 8 children and 4 sons of William the Conqueror. Given that his older brothers were already nearing their adult years by that time, it was very unlikely that Henry would ever rise to become ruler of an extensive part of his father's dominions. Yet the death of Richard, followed by the rivalry between Robert and William Rufus, allowed him to carve out a position for himself in northern France, aided by Robert's inept rule in Normandy and his subsequent decision to head on the First Crusade. All of these issues put Henry in prime position to succeed William Rufus when he died prematurely in 1100, though his death may not have been as accidental as it seems, and perhaps Henry had his older brother killed. As king, Henry hewed his own path. He demoted many powerful individuals and promoted his own followers as the new men, while also expanding royal government and taxation. He also finally brought about an end to Robert's ambitions, imprisoning his own brother for several decades. At the end of his life, a decision which has shaped Henry's reputation for cruelty to a significant extent. But while he might have successfully claimed complete control over his father's dominions by the 1110s, the disaster of the White Ship cast a pall over his reign as the succession became very unclear. Ultimately, Henry might be said to have succeeded in many ways throughout his life, but in the end, he could not fully impress on the English nobility the wisdom of accepting his daughter as queen when he was gone. The anarchy which followed ultimately overshadowed his reign. Stephen, later known as King Stephen of England, entered this world at some point in the mid-1090s. Some historians, who are acknowledged authorities on his existence and reign, argue for a year of birth as early as 1092. Others suggest he could have been born as late as 1096. It is important to bear this in mind, especially when considering the events of the 1100s and 1110s, as the gap of 4 years makes a considerable difference in evaluating whether Stephen's actions at these times were those of a child, a teenager, or a young man. There is more consensus concerning his place of birth, and it is generally accepted that he was born in the town of Blois, in the Loire Valley, between Orléans and Tours. Stephen's father was Stephen Henry, Count of Blois, a major French feudal, lord of the late 11th century. He was already a man of about 50 years at the time of Stephen's birth. If Stephen was born in 1096, then he would have arrived after his father had left for the Holy Land to take part in the First Crusade to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christian cause. Stephen's mother was Adela of Normandy. She was born in the second half of the 1060s and was a daughter of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 led a Norman army across the English Channel and began the conquest of England right around the time Adela was born. Her marriage to Stephen Henry in the early 1080s was a political union designed to forge an alliance between her father, by then King William I of England, and the Count of Blois. Her father died in 1087 and was succeeded by his son, Adela's brother, King William II, better known as William Rufus, most likely in reference to his red hair or beard. Hence, when Stephen was born in the mid-1090s, his uncle was the King of England. Stephen's wider family exerted influence beyond England itself. When William the Conqueror conquered England, he was already Duke of Normandy and had extended his rule over some other adjoining territories in northern France as well, such that the family controlled lands on both sides of the English Channel. Indeed, the conqueror considered his primary role to be that of Duke of Normandy, even after conquering England, and he spent much of the 1070s and 1080s in France, even after becoming ruler of England. After his death, his territories did not pass undivided to William Rufus. Instead, the conqueror's other sons, Robert and Henry, played a greater role in Normandy and the other French territories, while William Rufus ruled England. This arrangement was scuppered in August 1100, when the king was killed during a suspicious hunting accident in the New Forest in Hampshire, England. When this occurred, his brother Henry quickly moved to seize power and became the new monarch as King Henry V of England. With this, Stephen, who was still a child aged between 4 and 8 depending on his year of birth, swapped having one uncle as King of England for another, while his third uncle Robert would exercise control over Normandy for some years to come. He was defeated militarily by Henry at the Battle of Tinchebray and imprisoned for the rest of his life. Consequently, much of Stephen's life would be lived in the shadow of his powerful uncle, who from 1106 onwards controlled England and the family's territories in Normandy and elsewhere in northern France. As with any monarch of the High Middle Ages, there are only a small number of administrative records or examples of correspondence that have survived for the near millennium since Stephen's time, with which to shed light on his life. As a result, we are largely reliant on the histories and chronicles of the era in order to reconstruct the events that involved Stephen and the role he played in them. These were mostly written by ecclesiastical figures, monks or abbots, and bishops who were close to those in power. One was the Historia Novella, or New History, of William of Malmesbury, a highly learned monk who was born in the mid-1090s and was an exact contemporary of Stephen. The Benedictine monk, Orderic Vitalis, wrote an ecclesiastical history which covers the period up to 1141 and sheds extensive light on Stephen's life prior to becoming King of England and the first years of his reign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a long account of the history of medieval England, provides an illuminating narrative of how damaged the social and economic fabric of England was by the civil wars of the 1140s, to which, as we will see, Stephen was so central. Finally, the Gesta Stephani, or Acts of Stephen, is perhaps the greatest source of all for Stephen's time as King of England. The text was anonymous, though some historians of 12th century England contend that it was composed by Robert of Bath, the Bishop of Bath, between 1136 and 1166, and an eyewitness to many of the events described in the Gesta. Unfortunately, because it could not have been predicted that Stephen would one day become King of England, these chroniclers were not paying attention to the obscure younger son of the Count of Blois in his earliest years, and we know very little about Stephen's early life. He was evidently raised at home in Blois. He had numerous siblings, including an older brother by the name of William. Under normal circumstances, in a society where primogeniture, the idea that the eldest son would succeed to a noble title, was emerging in its full form, it might have been expected that Stephen would have lived his life in the shadow of his older brother. However, William is believed to have been intellectually challenged in some way. There is no clear description of this, but he acquired the rather crude surname William the Simple, which probably indicates some psychological or mental issue, one which largely precluded him from playing an active role in political and military affairs. In his stead, Stephen and his other older brother Theobald emerged early on as the most capable. Stephen, Henry, and Adela's sons, another brother of theirs, died at a young age. Stephen received a decent enough education during these years. The standards of the time, where his grandfather William the Conqueror was illiterate, Stephen was taught to read and write and was able to understand Latin. This was a sign of the Renaissance in learning, which was occurring across Europe during this period as the continent's first universities were set up and began to produce new generations of scholars and teachers. Stephen's father was absent during his earliest years. He took part in the First Crusade to the Holy Land, which succeeded in setting up a number of Christian states there in 1098 and 1099. The Count of Blois' contribution to the effort was dubious, though he was present at the siege of the city of Antioch in 1098. However, he abandoned the crusade to head home at a critical juncture in the assault on the city. To compound matters, he was believed to have met with the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos on his way back through Anatolia and convinced the emperor that the crusade was a lost cause and that he should not march onwards to aid the Christian armies. In the event, he proved to be completely wrong in his analysis, and after the successful capture of Antioch, the Crusaders went on to conquer nearly all of the region, approximating modern-day Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, as well as parts of Syria and Jordan. During his absence in the east, Stephen's mother Adela headed up a regency government in Blois. She evidently liked the power it conveyed on her, and as soon as her husband arrived back in France, she began trying to convince him to head back east on the crusade as quickly as possible. He eventually agreed to do so, and in 1101 left again for the Levant. He made it to Jerusalem on this occasion, where a Crusader kingdom had been established after his premature flight home in 1098. The following year, before he could return to France, having completed his vow to visit the Holy City, he was captured by an Islamic army and executed shortly afterwards. Hence, other than a fleeting period in 1099 and 1100 when he was back in France, Stephen's memory of his father would have been almost non-existent. He grew up much closer to his mother Adela and, unusually for a noble child at the time, was raised in her household. When news of their father's death arrived in France, Stephen's older brother Theobald was made Count of Blois, though he was only 11 or 12 years old at the time. Adela would continue to act as regent for several years to come. While Theobald had succeeded as Count of Blois on their father's death, this certainly did not preclude Stephen from aspiring to a position of authority in France or the wider world of Western Europe. This was especially the case in light of the difficult circumstances prevailing in England and Normandy. Henry I had over 20 children, but most of them were born as a result of relationships outside of marriage, and so, by the standards of medieval Europe, could not be considered legitimate successors to his dominions. Conversely, he had left it very late to marry. Finally, wedding his first wife, Matilda of Scotland, daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland, until 1100 when Henry was already in his 30s, an old age to marry by the standards of the High Middle Ages. The union did result in 2 children in quick succession, a daughter named Matilda, after her mother, in the spring of 1102, and a son named William Adelin in August 1103. Thereafter, the marriage produced no further children, and so the succession to Henry rested principally on just one legitimate male heir, William Adelin. Given the tenuous nature of the succession and the lack of a spare male heir, Henry began taking an interest in his nephew in the 1100s. It was an indication of Stephen's promise as he grew up that his uncle increasingly viewed him as someone who might play a major role in the governance of the French part of his dominions in Normandy and adjoining territories. This promotion of young Stephen took place in the years after 1106, following Henry's defeat of his brother Robert and seizure of the Duchy of Normandy. In response to the imprisonment of Robert by Henry, King Louis VI of France began promoting the claim of William Clito, Robert's son and heir, to succeed as Duke of Normandy. This placed Henry in a difficult position, as it was not easy to govern his new French territories from England. Therefore, he began constructing an alliance of friendly French nobles that would serve to protect Normandy from attacks by Louis's and the other supporters of William Clito. Part of this involved courting his sister and the lords of the county of Blois, and he did so by showing favour to Adela's favourite son, Stephen. Part of this involved Stephen spending significant periods of time in the entourage of Henry when he visited Normandy and held court at Rouen. By the late 1100s, Stephen may have been as old as 16 or 17, and was also in a position to accompany Henry on military campaigns in northern France. He even played a leading role in 1111 in suppressing the revolt of Robert of Bellême, a Norman lord with holdings in both England and the county of Ponthieu in France. The following year, Henry knighted Stephen, by which time he was at least 16 years old and perhaps as much as 20 years. Henry's patronage and promotion of his nephew continued in the years that followed. In the mid-1110s, Stephen crossed the English Channel to visit England for the first time and was given extensive privileges there. These included the honour of Lancaster, a feudal fief in the Lancaster region of England, one which made Henry one of the premier feudal lords of the country at a very young age. Further grants of land in the Alençon region of southern Normandy and elsewhere in France followed. All of this was conspicuous. By the late 1110s, it could be argued that Henry was promoting Stephen in a highly unusual fashion, almost as one would his designated heir. Perhaps this was owing to reservations which the king held about his own son and successor, William. Adeline reached his 14th year in 1117 and began the passage into his adult years. By the standards of the 12th century, he may have been something of a disappointment as he grew up. One chronicler of the time described him as a pampered prince who would be swallowed up by the volatile and aggressive politics of the time. But as Stephen showed promise, whatever Henry's plans were, they were soon altered by events outside of everyone's control. On the 25th of November, 1120, after a major meeting of the court of King Henry III in Normandy, the king, his children, and illegitimate children, along with the senior aristocrats and other courtiers, began making their way back to England. The king had made other plans, but the captain of a vessel named the White Ship, Thomas Fitzstephen, made the ship available to others to make the passage across the channel. That evening, what was by all accounts a fairly drunken royal party, one which included the king's heir, William Adelin, and numerous courtiers and nobles, as well as several of Henry's illegitimate children, descended on the ship. There were approximately 300 in all, more than the ship could comfortably fit. This was fortunate for Stephen, who was with the party and decided to get off and wait for another ship to travel over to England, leaving the drunken party to head on without him. Not long afterwards, he possibly watched as the White Ship struck a large rock, which was almost entirely submerged in the harbour. According to the source, all but one of the passengers drowned, an unusual development given how close to the shore they were. One might have expected that more would have swum to safety. Amongst the deceased was William Adelin, King Henry's only legitimate son and heir. His death would cast the succession issue wide open, and as a close male relative of the king, Stephen would become a major player in the scheming which followed in the 1120s. In the immediate aftermath of William Adelin's death, Henry's desire for a child of his own to succeed him became evident. Despite his lavish promotion of Stephen in previous years, there was only one option left: Henry's legitimate daughter, Matilda, a girl of 18. She had already been married for several years to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful feudal lord in a politically divided Germany. Despite the fact that she was a woman and that she was absent elsewhere in Europe, and had been so for many years, Henry moved to make her his heir designate in the aftermath of the disaster of the White Ship. Admittedly, he did also try to shore up the succession in other ways. His first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died in 1118, and Henry remarried shortly after the White Ship disaster, this time to Adeliza of Louvain, a daughter of the Count of Louvain and a woman of perhaps little. More than 17 years at the time of the marriage, the hope was that this second union, with someone with many childbearing years ahead, would produce a new legitimate male heir. But there was no luck on that front. In front, the marriage would not lead to further children for Henry, the Baron, the nature of it most likely being due to the king's own advanced years. Adeliza would have a child many years later when she married for the second time. What this meant in the 1120s and 1130s was that Matilda remained Henry's only living legitimate child and the heir to the throne of England. There were signs already by the mid-1120s that Matilda would be a tough sell as Henry's heir. In France itself, it was generally accepted that a woman could not succeed as a queen regnant or major feudal lady, the belief being firmly entrenched that the primary duty of a ruler was as a military leader and that this precluded women from ruling. The situation was more complex in England, a country which had had numerous female monarchs over the centuries. Henry hoped to placate his feudal lords and gain their acceptance of Matilda as his heir in 1128, when, after her first husband, Emperor Henry V, died in 1125, she was remarried to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, one of the more powerful lords of northern France, whose lands lay along the southern border of the Duchy of Normandy. This backfired, though, when the unpopular Geoffrey made the lords of England and northern France even more reluctant to accept Matilda as the king's heir. The ill feeling was compounded by high levels of taxation, which Henry was imposing at the time to pay for several border wars in France. Unperturbed, Henry convened gatherings of his lords, including Stephen, on several occasions between 1127 and 1131, to have them swear oaths to accept Matilda as his heir when he passed away. Despite these outward shows of obedience, a major question still hung over events. Would these oaths be honoured when the king was dead, or would the lords seek to crown a male monarch? While this political wrangling and unrest was underway, Stephen's personal situation was changing too. Like his uncle, King Henry, he had left it relatively late to marry, but eventually, in 1125, he finally married for the first time, by which time he was either at the very end of his 20s or heading on for his mid-30s, depending on the year of his birth. To further confuse matters, another Matilda was involved, the third in our story so far. Matilda of Boulogne was a daughter of Count Eustace II of Boulogne, the ruler of the Boulogne fief near Calais in the northeastern extremity of France, lying along the shores of the English Channel. The county of Boulogne was a significant polity in the cross-channel politics between England and northern France. Furthermore, Matilda's mother was Mary of Scotland, a daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland. Hence, Matilda was a niece-in-law of King Henry, her mother having been the sister of Henry's first wife. Accordingly, the marriage was politically astute and became even more important within weeks of the wedding, when Matilda's father died without a male heir, and she and Stephen ascended as Count and Countess of Boulogne, further strengthening Stephen's position in northern France and on the southern side of the English Channel from his new lordship in Boulogne. Stephen continued to position himself to be a major figure in the succession politics of the second half of the 1120s and into the 1130s. He was still highly regarded by his uncle, who had facilitated the marriage union with Matilda of Boulogne. Stephen returned the favour by acting as Henry's representative in the region straddling northern France and Flanders, in what is now Belgium. Here, William Clito, the son of Henry's brother Robert, was scheming to become Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful thrones in northern Europe during the High Middle Ages. Henry was anxious to prevent this, and Stephen obliged him by undermining William Clito's efforts. This all stood in stark contrast to Henry's relationship with his daughter and heir Matilda and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou. They were pressuring Henry to begin transferring power to them before he died, principally by handing over control of castles and lands in northern France. Their argument that this would facilitate the succession to Matilda once Henry died was reasonable, but Henry did not view it as such. The final years of his life saw a perceptible tension between the king and his daughter and son-in-law. It was under this cloud of deteriorating relations with his family members that old King Henry died at the start of December 1135. Chroniclers of the time suggested his demise was owing to eating too many lampreys, a type of fish. Perhaps this did play a part in his death, but in any event, Henry was well into his 60s by that time, and an old man by the standards of the 12th century. As news of the king's death spread, Stephen was well placed to position himself as a potential successor. The king had died in Normandy, and Stephen received the news before most other contenders for the throne, as he was not far away in Boulogne at the time. Geoffrey and Matilda were further south in Anjou, and such was their unpopularity by that time that few supporters rushed to their cause. Another plausible successor was Stephen's brother Theobald, the Count of Blois, though it soon transpired that he too lacked the kind of support which was available to Stephen. Stephen moved swiftly to capitalize on his advantageous position. He and his closest followers mobilized and quickly crossed the English Channel to arrive in England within days of Henry's death. There, they faced some opposition from Matilda's supporters. Nevertheless, by the 8th of December, Stephen was near London, and in the days that followed, he cemented popular support for his accession in the capital and began taking over the levers of government. Over the next week, an agreement was worked out with the Archbishop of Canterbury, William de Corbet, whereby, in spite of the Archbishop's oath to support Matilda's succession, he agreed to crown Stephen as the senior ecclesiastical lord of England. Then a story was concocted with some of the late king's senior ministers claimed that Henry I had renounced Matilda as his heir on his deathbed and approved Stephen as his successor. With the wheeling and dealing done, and those in positions of power convinced to support him, Stephen was officially crowned as King Stephen III of England at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December, 1135. It was just 3 weeks to the day since King Henry's death, and in France, Matilda was able to do very little to try to alter the trajectory of events. It was not the end of her claim to the throne, though, far from it. In a somewhat unusual development, Stephen did not initially face military difficulties from rival candidates to the throne of England from northern France. Instead, the first 2 to 3 years of his reign were principally concerned with shoring up his position in England itself, dealing with fractious lords within England and border incursions from Wales and Scotland. The most pressing issue was to the north, where King David I of Scotland had taken advantage of the temporary lull in English royal power upon the death of King Henry to invade northern England. The lands around Northumbria and the adjoining shires were contested between the English and the Scots throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, and a diplomatic realignment resulting from a change of king was a common reason for outbreaks of hostilities along the border. This one was more substantial than others, with David marching well into England and seizing the important northern towns of Carlisle and Newcastle. In response, Stephen marched north early in 1136 and campaigned against the Scots. Clashes over, several weeks were enough to convince both monarchs of the wisdom of finding a swift solution. Stephen, who was anxious to end the campaign and return south in order to continue consolidating his position, ceded Carlisle to David in return for peace. With this concluded, Stephen headed south again. No sooner had he returned southwards than Stephen had to engage with an incursion from several Welsh lords into the March region between eastern Wales and the English West Midlands. The Normans had begun efforts to conquer Wales during the reign of Stephen's grandfather, William the Conqueror, but this was only ever a partial conquest and would not be fully completed until the late 13th century. While Stephen was absent in the north campaigning against the Scots, several Welsh lords revolted, winning a significant victory at the Battle of Croydon in January 1136. By the summer of 1136, there was a full revolt in progress in South Wales, led by figures like Owain, Gwynedd, one of the Welsh princes. Stephen and several Norman marcher lords campaigned aggressively against them in the months that followed. But as with the Scottish border, Stephen was not committed to winning a decisive victory, merely to limiting any potential damage that war might cause. In 1137, he agreed to peace terms through which the English state left the Welsh lords to manage their own affairs. The reason that Stephen would make no further effort to intervene in Wales over his reign was owing to the outbreak of the Civil War, which would characterize both his reign and the entirety of English political history for a decade and a half. In the middle of the 12th century, the Anarchy began in 1138, a civil war which pitted Stephen and his supporters against those who wished to uphold old King Henry's desire for his legitimate daughter Matilda to succeed him. Matilda and her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had been committed to challenging Stephen's accession from the very beginning of the reign, but it was not until 1138 that they were in a position to press their cause. The civil war was ignited when 2 very powerful English lords agreed to join their cause. These were Robert, Earl of Gloucester, an illegitimate son of King Henry I, and thus a half-brother of Matilda. He was one of the leading peers of the realm and had made clear from the very beginning that he was uneasy with the manner in which Stephen had usurped the throne in December 1135. In 1138, he agreed to take up arms in support of Matilda. Second was Ranulph, the 4th Earl of Chester. He was a leading Anglo-Norman magnate. Some of his lands in the north of England had been sacrificed by Stephen as the price of peace with the Scots in 1136, and his resentment at this led him to join the revolt when it began in 1138. Thus, with support from senior lords on both sides of the English Channel, Matilda and Geoffrey entered open conflict with Stephen. The first stages of the war occurred in 1139 when the Angevins, so named for the fact that Matilda's husband was the Count of Anjou, invaded England from northern France with the die-cast. Matilda's supporters made their allegiances clear. The dead King Henry's widow, Adeliza, also threw her support behind her stepdaughter. In the months that followed and into 1140, the battle lines were drawn as Matilda's faction won control over much of northern England, where Ranulph of Chester was one of the preeminent feudal lords, and in western England, with the port city of Bristol emerging as a stronghold for Matilda in the region, buoyed by Robert of Gloucester's strong position. Here, meanwhile, Stephen retained control of the bulk of southern and eastern England, a position which gave him control of London, Oxford, and the wealthier parts of England around Kent and Sussex in the south, as well as into East Anglia and beyond. Although some parts of the country would be gained and lost by both Stephen and Matilda's supporters over the years, this was the general geopolitical situation which would pertain for much of the civil war that was just beginning. Yet often the map was more complicated still, as local lords and magnates, or even church figures like the Bishop of Ely, gained control of small patches of land and shifted allegiances over and back as they tried to benefit themselves during the prolonged period of uncertainty. It was this chaotic situation, combined with the violence and the breakdown of royal government, which partly led to the Civil War becoming known as the Anarchy. One of the most critical episodes in the entire war began in the first days of 1141, when Stephen and his followers laid siege to Lincoln Castle, where Robert of Chester and some of his closest supporters were lodging. Stephen hoped to win this key stronghold lying between East Anglia and York in the north. At first, Robert seemed to be caught unprepared, but the move soon turned against Stephen when, at the start of February 1141, Robert of Gloucester arrived in Lincoln to relieve the siege and to try to strike a decisive blow against Stephen's cause. The resulting Battle of Lincoln was one of the most important clashes of the entire Civil War, though it probably involved little more than 1,000 men on either side, an indication of the limited nature of warfare in 12th century England. Gloucester and his allies had the better of it, owing to a large contingent of Welsh auxiliaries who had joined Matilda's cause in 1139. As their position became clear, many of Stephen's most important knights and allies fled from the field, and the battle soon turned into little more than an effort by Stephen and a small band of knights to try and fight their way to safety. They did not succeed, and by the time the clash ended, Robert of Gloucester and Robert of Chester were not just victorious, but had managed to capture Stephen as well. In the aftermath of the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen was taken back as a prisoner by Gloucester to the West Midlands and was presented to Matilda. She ordered his confinement in Bristol Castle, and deliberations were now entered into as to what should be done. Matilda had seemingly won a clear victory, but Stephen was a crowned and anointed king and, in both canon and common law, could not simply be dispensed with without a clear legal justification. Hence, several weeks of negotiations followed in which several senior archbishops and bishops of the English Church indicated their willingness to support Stephen's deposition and the crowning of Matilda as queen, though others refused. In the end, the breakthrough came when Stephen indicated from his confinement at Bristol that his supporters should allow Matilda to become queen. In the circumstances, he probably felt he had little choice. And so in April 1141, Stephen was, to all intents and purposes, deposed and Matilda became queen. Unusually, she took the title Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English, rather than queen. While many chroniclers of the High Middle Ages, and for centuries afterwards, referred to her as Empress Matilda, rather than Queen Matilda, a designation, owing to her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor and her position as his empress. Matilda also continued to use the title long after leaving Germany. This uncertainty around her title reflected the realities of her limited power when Matilda and her supporters attempted to descend on London to have her crowned. Crowned at Westminster, the Londoners rejected her and remained steadfast in their loyalty to Stephen. In this fluid situation, with Matilda having emerged temporarily victorious over Stephen, the king himself was imprisoned, though parts of England refused to acknowledge Matilda. The political landscape in northern France also experienced an important change when news reached the county of Anjou of the defeat and capture of Stephen at Lincoln. Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, invaded the Duchy of Normandy and occupied much of it. Stephen's older brother Theobald did very little to stop him, being conscious of both the difficulty of withstanding the onslaught with Stephen's fortunes in such decline in England, and also having his own troubles to contend with against the French monarchy. The Angevins would retain control over most of Normandy throughout the 1140s and into the early 1150s, and henceforth, the civil war would largely be contained to England itself. Geoffrey of Anjou was even able to have himself formally acknowledged by many of the Norman lords as Duke of Normandy in 1144. Stephen's cause was at an extreme low. In the spring of 1141, however, all was not lost. Though captive himself, his wife Matilda of Boulogne proved herself to be a capable leader of his cause, while Stephen was being held at Bristol. She soon managed to reassemble an alliance of some of England's leading magnates to resist Matilda's ascension to power, aided considerably by Stephen's brother Henry, Bishop of Winchester. They also had the support of William of Ypres, the leader of a major contingent of Flemish mercenaries from the Low Countries. In the autumn of 1141, their combined forces marched towards Winchester, where Matilda and Gloucester's armies were trying to secure the region for her and have the lords there acknowledge Matilda's accession as queen. What followed at Winchester on the 14th of September 1141 was a direct inversion of the result at the Battle of Lincoln 7 months earlier. Matilda's forces were routed and heavily defeated, and Robert of Gloucester was taken captive in the aftermath of the engagement. Matilda of Boulogne and Bishop Henry of Winchester were able to trade Gloucester's release for the release of Stephen. Set at liberty at the beginning of November 1141, Stephen began to re-establish himself as king, and in December, he and his wife undertook a second coronation as a means of reaffirming Stephen's position as King of England and in an effort to delegitimize Matilda's accession months earlier. Matilda was never formally deposed, and so across the 1140s, there was a rival queen regnant in the shape of Empress Matilda and a king regnant in the shape of King Stephen. The anarchy would continue unabated for many years to come, despite the dramatic events of 1141. Having fortuitously gained his freedom in the late autumn of 1141 and begun to restore his authority, it all nearly came to a shuddering halt for Stephen the following year. Early in 1142, he fell seriously ill. Seriously ill, what caused his illness has never been satisfactorily resolved. It could well have been the case that the circumstances of his imprisonment at Bristol Castle for several months the previous year had weakened his system and left him ill. The conditions might have been such that pneumonia or all manner of other sicknesses were possible. Whatever the cause, it is clear that contemporaries believed that Stephen was on the verge of death in the spring of 1142. Then, somewhat miraculously, he made a swift recovery and began an energetic new military campaign, one in which he managed to win over Ralph of Chester for a brief time to his side in the war before laying siege to Oxford. In the autumn of 1142, Empress Matilda was there at the time, and Stephen very nearly captured her, something which would have surely led to a major shift in the course of the war had he done so. It was not to be, though. Matilda and a handful of close supporters slipped out of Oxford Castle under the cover of night and made their way westwards. After the dramatic events of the years between 1140 and 1142, the years that followed in the mid-1140s saw the Civil War enter into a period of stalemate. Neither side made a major breakthrough, although at the same time there were near constant clashes between regional supporters of both Stephen and Matilda's causes. The conflict was extremely damaging, and many chroniclers of the time noted the devastation across England and northern France. Agriculture was interrupted across the Norman dominions, and there was a general economic decline. After a lengthy period of improvement under Henry III, scores of castles were destroyed, and towns and villages were sacked brutally by wandering bands of soldiers on both sides of the divide. It was this general sense of a land experiencing devastation for years which led the chroniclers to lament it so much, and for subsequent historians to term it the Anarchy. Like many modern wars, it also led to innovations. The incessant warfare and the destruction of existing motte and bailey wooden castles led to a swift adoption of the new concept of stronger stone castles, particularly in England, where motte and bailey fortifications still dotted the countryside. As destructive as the Anarchy was, it was also a period in the second half of the 12th century and into the 13th and 14th in which some of England's finest stone castles were erected. By this time, Stephen was entering his 50s, and Matilda was also well into her 40s. Therefore, as the Anarchy continued, the focus of it shifted in the course of the 1140s from Stephen and his cousin as rival contenders for the throne to their own offspring. Stephen and his wife Matilda of Boulogne had several children by then. Their eldest son, Eustace, was born around 1130. From the point at which Stephen claimed the throne of England in December 1135, Eustace was the next in line to become King of England, though clearly his position politically was marginal while still a child. However, he was old enough to be promoted and was expected to engage in military campaigning himself. In 1146, he was promoted to the position of Count of Boulogne in France, and knelt not long afterwards as his father began preparing him to succeed him one day. Stephen and Matilda also had a daughter named Marie, who was born in 1136. In the late 1140s, Stephen began promoting her to play a prominent role in the female religious orders in England, a position which was essentially political in the High Middle Ages. Such was the power and wealth of the medieval religious orders. Another son, William, was married to Isabel de Warenne, the only legitimate child of William de Warenne, 3rd Earl of Surrey. In 1148, just a few months after Sarah had died, William was promoted to become Earl of Surrey through marriage at just 11 years of age. Finally, like his uncle Henry, Stephen also had illegitimate children, the foremost of which was a son named James, whom Stephen had made the abbot of Westminster Abbey in 1138, an important ecclesiastical office which he abused through his corrupt behavior. All of this was designed to embed Stephen's wider family into the political and aristocratic world of England, and to shore up his dynasty in the process. A similar situation was developing across the English Channel in the county of Anjou. Matilda and Geoffrey had 3 sons in the 1130s. Chief amongst these was their eldest son Henry, an heir who became known to the chroniclers of the time as Henry Fitz Empress, Fitz meaning son of, and the Empress referring to his mother's first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor, and the continuing use of the title of Empress. Henry was born in March 1133 and was just a few years younger than Stephen's eldest son Eustace. Already by 1142, when he was just 9 years of age, his parents began involving Henry in the politics of the Civil War and sent him to England to spend time in the household of his step-uncle, Robert of Gloucester. The point of this was to present in person Matilda's heir to the English lords who supported her cause. Henry, after all, would be her successor one day if she was to emerge victorious in the Civil War. This is increasingly how the Civil War began, to develop in the second half of the 1140s and into the early 1150s. It was no longer a conflict to see if Stephen or Matilda would rule in the long run, but which might emerge victorious in their old age and ensure the succession of their son, Eustace of Boulogne, or Henry of Anjou. The 2 sons became more central to the military campaigning as the years went by, especially on Matilda's side after. Her second husband and Henry's father Geoffrey died in September 1151, at which juncture young Henry became the de facto head of Matilda's military campaign. Even as the cast of those who were involved in the fighting changed, it remained a somewhat timid affair, such that several historians of the High Middle Ages have questioned whether we should even speak of a continued civil war in the late 1140s. Had a significant feature: the death of Robert of Gloucester in October 1147. With the passing of one of Matilda's foremost supporters in England, the political and military landscape changed further. Stephen and his allies were now more secure in their control of England, while Matilda and the supporters of the Angevins continued to control the Norman dominions across northern France. Another development was that the Second Crusade to the Holy Land began in 1145 and lasted until 1149 in response to the conquest of the county of Edessa by the Muslim powers of the Levant in 1144. This drew many of the lords and soldiers who might have continued the war between Stephen and Matilda away from Western Europe to the east. In this environment, Henry tried to launch several invasions of England in the second half of the 1140s, but these amounted to very little. In one instance, Stephen simply paid off the mercenaries that Henry's army was largely comprised of and ordered them to return home to France. The final stages of the Anarchy came in the early 1150s. By then, Stephen's position had been somewhat weakened due to a dispute that had emerged between him and the church authorities in England since the mid-1140s. While Ranulph of Chester continued to hold control over large stretches of the north of England, in 1153, Henry Fitz Empress, who by then had succeeded as Count of Anjou, was able to deploy greater resources than on previous occasions. He arrived in England again, where he built up support around Bristol and the surrounding region for his and his mother's cause. A period of pronounced military engagement and clashes followed over several months, much of it focused on a siege of Wallingford Castle in Oxfordshire, on the periphery of Henry and Stephen's spheres of control. Something very unusual happened at this juncture. Many of Stephen and Henry's closest supporters now indicated an unwillingness to participate in a new bout of violent engagements, which could destabilize England in a way not seen since the early 1140s. Faced with this unprecedented situation, Stephen and Henry entered negotiations, which were brokered by leading members of the English Church. The end result was the Treaty of Wallingford, also known as the Treaty of Winchester, which was agreed upon at the scene of the siege late in 1153. Under the terms of this treaty, Stephen, who knew that he now faced a young, energetic, and capable enemy in the shape of Henry, and who was also in a difficult position regarding church support in England, agreed that Henry would succeed him when he died. This was something many people assumed was not many years away, given that Stephen was around 60 years of age by that time. This involved Stephen abandoning the claims of his sons to succeed him as King of England, but would ensure peace during Stephen's final years. The Wallingford Agreement was confirmed shortly afterwards by a more formal treaty agreed upon at Winchester. The Treaty of Wallingford was a peculiar agreement through which Stephen had effectively renounced the claims of his son Eustace or any of his other children to the throne of England. Eustace was clearly disgruntled with the decision, though there is a debate as to whether or not Stephen genuinely intended to accept the terms of the treaty, or if he was simply buying time to strengthen his position again, and would then recommence the war and impose Eustace as his heir. This latter theory certainly corresponds with some of his actions following the agreement. The months after Wallingford was finalized saw Stephen engaging in a flurry of activity. First, he tried to reduce the power of Hugh, a perennially overmighty feudal lord in England, while he was also building up his military base once again. A setback occurred when Eustace died suddenly and prematurely in the autumn of 1153. Though Stephen's other son, William, now became a potential heir to Stephen, questions remain as to whether Stephen was planning to eventually renounce the terms of the Wallingford Agreement and try to make William his heir once he had built up enough strength and support for such a move. If this was Stephen's plan, it would never come to fruition. By the time the Wallingford Agreement was reached in 1153, the king was at least 57 years of age, depending on the time of his birth, and perhaps into his early 60s, old age in the 12th century. Despite his advanced years, he spent the first months of 1154 travelling around England and making preparations for reform of the kingdom, and perhaps to plot the succession of his son, William. One major port of call was the northern city of York. He then traversed the entire country again, heading for Dover in Kent in the southeast of England. It is plausible that this extensive travel exacerbated some pre-existing illnesses, although Stephen's death may also have been entirely unexpected. In any event, we do know that he fell ill after reaching Kent, complaining of a stomach ailment, and died shortly thereafter on the 25th of October 1154. The exact cause of his death remains unclear. An ailment such as stomach cancer or severe gastritis may have been involved. He was quickly buried at Faversham Abbey in Kent. Stephen had patronized the establishment of the abbey just a few years earlier, and both his wife Matilda and their eldest son Eustace, who had died only so recently, were also interred there. The abbey was dissolved and largely destroyed in 1538 as part of the dissolution of England's monasteries during the English Reformation. In 1964, the empty tombs of Stephen and his family members were discovered, and there is a lack of clarity as to where their remains ended up after the 1530s, with local law contending their bones were thrown into a local creek. Stephen's death occurred at a broadly propitious time for bringing the long-running civil war to an end. Eustace's death a year earlier had ensured there was no power struggle between him and Henry, which there surely would have been, had both men still been alive when Stephen died. Furthermore, with the Treaty of Wallingford having only so recently been negotiated, the other potential claimants to the throne were willing to accept Henry's succession as King Henry II of England. This new period of England's history is known as the Anarchy to indicate Henry's descent through the House of Anjou and the extent of his territorial holdings on both sides of the English Channel. Under other circumstances, Some of England's nobles might have encouraged Stephen's younger son William to push his claims to the throne, but after nearly 2 decades of civil war and destruction, peace was broadly favoured by all. Henry II settled into a long reign. He would rule as King of England until 1189, though in time his own fractured family would sow disorder across England and Normandy. While the succession of his son John as king in 1199 ushered in an era in which the Angevins lost the bulk of their lands in northern France, periods of civil war and disorder would punctuate England's medieval history every few decades for centuries to come. King Stephen has often been viewed poorly by historians of England and France in the High Middle Ages. The reasons for this are obvious. His long reign of nearly 2 decades was a period of near continuous civil war, societal disruption, and economic destruction across England, so much so that it is known as the Anarchy. The chronicles and histories of the time present a picture of a country ravaged by the conflict between the supporters of Stephen and Matilda. Many historians since have understandably laid the blame for much of this on Stephen, and yet this is possibly unfair. The crisis was created by a succession dispute, which was generated to a large extent by the nobles of England and northern France, who were unwilling to accept Matilda as the successor to Henry I. Had they done so, the chaos could have been avoided. When it did begin, it was perpetuated by Matilda, Geoffrey, and then their son Henry. Stephen certainly played a part in all of this, but he was just one player in the whole sorry saga. Conversely, Henry I's promotion of him, and the attitude of a great many feudal lords of England and northern France towards him, would surely seem to indicate that Stephen was a capable figure with many good qualities. What was really at issue were structural weaknesses in the English and Norman state in the 12th century, and also the sheer happenstance of family creation. If Henry I had sired more legitimate sons, the anarchy would almost certainly have been avoided. That this wasn't the case was not Stephen's fault, though there is no doubting his centrality to the years of war and discord which followed the death of Henry I. And so concludes our peaceful journey through the Norman dynasty. Sweet dreamer. From William the Conqueror's momentous victory at Hastings to the end of the anarchy with Henry II's succession, we've witnessed nearly a century of transformation that shaped England forever. These Norman kings, conquerors, administrators, and warriors left an indelible mark on the realm, creating the foundations of medieval England that would endure for centuries. Their legacy lives on in castles, laws, and the very language we speak today. Thank you for joining us on this tranquil exploration of Norman England. May these gentle tales of medieval majesty carry you peacefully into dreamland, where Norman knights still ride through misty English countryside under starlit skies. Until we meet again in the realm of dreams, sleep well, dear listener.